Deep in the Amazon basin, where rivers run the color of black tea and the canopy seals out the sky like a living vault, there are stories the water refuses to let die. Explorers have returned from certain river channels, speaking in hushed, shaken voices about something they glimpsed beneath the surface. Something vast, something unhurried, something that seemed to regard their small wooden vessel the way a continent regards a raindrop. These are not the exaggerated boasts of frightened men inventing drama around a campfire. These are the reluctant testimonies of researchers who had every professional reason to stay silent, and who spoke anyway, because what they witnessed in those dark waters would not stay buried. The Green Anaconda, Unease murinus, is already the heaviest snake on Earth by any scientific measure. Specimens documented by herpetologists have reached lengths that strain the imagination. Animals so heavy they can barely sustain their own weight on dry land, more comfortable and more powerful in water than anything that shares their river. But local communities along these rivers, the riverside people, the ribeirinhos, the indigenous tribes who have navigated these channels for uncounted generations, they speak of something else entirely. Something larger, something the scientific record has never fully caught and perhaps never fully wanted to. The Amazon itself seems designed to protect its largest secrets. An area that dwarfs Western Europe lies beneath that endless canopy, and 90% of it has never been meaningfully surveyed. Rivers change course here seasonally, swallowing landmarks, rerouting maps, burying evidence beneath meters of silt. The forest reclaims clearings within months. The water keeps its own counsel. The expedition at the center of this account set out with scientific intentions and a methodical plan. They were researchers, not thrill-seekers, not film crews chasing spectacle. They carried sampling equipment, notebooks, measuring instruments, and the quiet confidence of people who believed the Amazon, however formidable, was ultimately a place that yielded to patient scientific inquiry. The river channel they chose had been referenced in older expedition accounts as unusually productive for herpetological observation. A blackwater tributary where visibility dropped to nothing below the surface, and where the anaconda population was locally understood to be dense. They had no particular reason to expect the extraordinary. The wooden boat carried 4 of them into those channels in the weeks that followed. The vessel itself was a working craft worn by river use, roughly 6 meters of weathered grey planking, a canvas canopy amidships for shade, a faded rope coiled at the bow, a single outboard motor at the stern. The team leader was a man of perhaps 40 years, weathered European male, early 40s, close-cropped dark beard, faded olive field shirt, worn canvas hat with wide brim, notebook always in breast pocket, compact binoculars around his neck, who had worked Amazonian fieldwork long enough to know that the jungle rarely announced its intentions in advance. The others deferred to his judgment in matters of navigation and risk, though in those first days on the water there seemed to be little risk worth deferring about. The first days moved with the quiet rhythm of legitimate fieldwork. Water samples collected and catalogued, vegetation noted, bird populations logged, the occasional caiman spotted sunning on a half-submerged log and duly recorded. The river here ran deep despite its narrow appearance. Sounding lines dropped from the bow came back reporting surprising depths, dark columns of water beneath their hull, where no light had ever penetrated. It was beautiful in the way the Amazon is always beautiful. Oppressively, intimately, a beauty that doesn't invite admiration so much as demand submission. It was on the 3rd evening that the first Unease arrived, quiet as a change in weather. They had beached the boat on a low mud bank above the waterline, as was their practice, and set the camp in the margin between water and forest. The lead researcher noted in his records that evening that the river seemed unusually quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of dusk, when birds settle and the canopy hushes. This was a different silence, the kind that settles over a stretch of water when something large is present and everything smaller knows it. Local communities along these river systems have always understood this silence. The ribeirinhos, the river people who have lived these channels for generations, speak about it with the casual authority of those who have learned its meaning through experience rather than study. When the birds stop and the water lies too still, and the caiman have all slid from their logs, you do not go into that river. You do not trail your hand over the side of your boat. And above all, you do not make light of what might be moving below. The researchers had been told versions of this. That evening, sitting above their dark riverbank, they began to understand what the telling had failed to convey. Nothing came that night, but something was felt. One team member, sleeping near the water's edge, reported waking to a sensation of movement, not sound, not sight, but a physical displacement in the air, the feeling of something very large passing very close in the water just below. The lead researcher wrote it down. He was a meticulous man. He wrote down everything, including the things he couldn't explain. What he chose to do with that entry, whether to include it in the formal report, whether to share it with colleagues, would be decided later. That night, he simply recorded it and lay awake, listening to the silence the river had decided to keep. The next morning arrived in the way Amazon mornings do, mist heavy on the water, the canopy dripping, a chorus of unseen birds flooding the green air with sound. The silence of the previous night seemed to evaporate with the mist, and the team moved through their morning preparations with the practiced efficiency of people pushing uncertainty aside through the comfort of routine. The lead researcher scanned the water with his binoculars before they launched, holding on certain patches of still surface longer than others, saying nothing. They loaded the boat and pushed off into the Blackwater, and the current accepted them, and the jungle closed around them again, and for a while it seemed the night had been nothing more than imagination, finding shape in darkness. The encounter that would define the entire expedition came without theatrical announcement. They had been running a particularly narrow channel, one where the overhanging vegetation brushed the sides of the boat, and the water ran so dark it seemed less like liquid than like a gap in the world. One of the team members at the bow noticed it first, not the snake itself, but the water, a displacement. A bulge beneath the surface, slow-moving, continuous, traveling in a direction that did not match the current. The lead researcher was on his feet before anyone spoke. What they saw as it surfaced, just barely surfaced, was not a monster in any cinematic sense. It was, in its way, more disturbing than a monster would have been, an animal so perfectly evolved, so utterly in its element, that the boat and its 4 passengers registered to it as nothing more than a temporary inconvenience in the current. The head, broad and flat, the width of a man's chest, came level with the bow. And then came the body, and it kept coming. Scale is a concept the human mind resists when encountering something outside its experience. Researchers who study large snakes professionally understand, in an abstract way, that anacondas can attain exceptional size. They have held measuring tapes against preserved specimens, read journal papers, seen photographs. None of that preparation, none of it translates into the direct experience of being in a small boat while something passes alongside you for what seems like an impossible length of time, its body still moving through the water when logic tells you it should have ended long ago. The body was as thick, witnesses later recalled, as the base of a mature river palm, and it showed no sign of ending. Local communities know these animals not as scientific subjects, but as neighbors, formidable, occasionally dangerous, ultimately comprehensible within the logic of the river. Tribes along these river systems have oral traditions going back beyond the reach of written record, and in those traditions, the great anaconda is not merely large, it is purposeful. It is the river itself given form, the spine of the water world, the creature to which the river's health belongs. To encounter one of exceptional size is not, in these traditions, simply a matter of biology. It is a matter of territory and of respect, and of whether the creature decides you are worth acknowledging. The explorers, in their small wooden boat, were being acknowledged. The question was what that meant. What happened next is the part of the account that researchers who have studied similar testimonies find most significant and most difficult to categorize. The anaconda did not ignore the boat. Having revealed itself, having let them see its scale, its reality, its utterly unhurried existence, it turned toward them, not rushing, not attacking in any sense that word conventionally implies. Moving, as the water itself moves, with the particular patience of something that has never needed to hurry. The lead researcher gave an order, not loudly, not in panic. The quality of his voice, witnesses later agreed, was the thing they found most striking about those moments. Calm as the snake itself, stripped of everything except the core instruction. The outboard motor caught on the second pull. The boat moved sternward, back the way they had come, slowly at first so as not to create turbulence that might be read as threat. The anaconda did not pursue them. It held its position in the channel for what the researchers later estimated as several minutes, an eternity when you are watching it, notebook abandoned, professional detachment entirely dissolved. Then it sank. Not dramatically, not with any violence. It simply descended, the water accepting it back the way a doorway accepts the closing of a door, and the river was once again just a black water channel in the deep Amazon, looking like nothing had ever happened there at all. What they had witnessed, and what they tried for the following days to process into the language of science, was a nest protection behavior, or so they eventually concluded. The channel section where the encounter occurred, they later realized, fed into a sheltered oxbow, the kind of still, shallow, heavily vegetated backwater where anacondas have been documented resting with egg clutches, where the temperature and humidity create precisely the conditions the species requires during its most vulnerable, reproductive period. They had not been targeted as prey. They had been warned. The distinction matters, scientifically, behaviorally, and in the context of what their account tells us about the cognitive sophistication of an animal. Science has never fully credited with intentional communication. The nights that followed were different from the first. The team made camp further from the water's edge. The lead researcher spent long hours in the evenings writing in his journal, reconstructing the sequence of events with the methodical precision of a man trying to ensure that whatever had happened would be accurately preserved, regardless of what he decided to do with it later. The others spoke about it in the way people speak about things that exist somewhere between experience and dream, carefully, as though careless speech might collapse the memory into something too ordinary to hold. The Amazon has hosted this kind of reckoning before. Across more than a century of documented scientific expeditions into the basin, the recurring pattern in field journals and expedition reports is not the confident proclamation of discovery. It is the quieter, more unsettling record of encounter with things that exceed the categories available to record them. Herpetologists specifically have grappled for generations with the anaconda size problem. Physical specimens recovered and measured have yielded extraordinary results that still fall short of the most persistent eyewitness reports, leading to an ongoing debate about what maximum size the species can achieve and whether the conditions of the deep Amazon might produce outliers that collection expeditions have simply never captured. Western science in these conversations tends toward the conservative, toward what has been measured, photographed, preserved, verified. What the Ribeirinhos have known for generations, what the Kayapo and the Yanomami and the many river peoples have encoded in story and ceremony, and the unwritten knowledge that passes from elder to child along the water, is that the Amazon's largest inhabitants are not uniformly distributed and not uniformly observable. The great animals use the deepest channels, the most inaccessible backwaters, the flooded forest during high water season when even experienced navigators avoid certain areas. They are not absent from the scientific record because they don't exist. They are absent because the Amazon makes certain things available only to those patient enough, quiet enough, and fortunate enough, or perhaps unfortunate enough, to earn the encounter. Satellite imagery in recent decades has begun to reveal what ground expedition could never have mapped. The geoglyphs, enormous geometric earthworks hidden beneath the canopy and invisible from ground level, confirmed that the Amazon harbored civilizations of a scale and sophistication that academic consensus had long denied. The discovery of terra preta, the extraordinary engineered dark soil found throughout the basin, evidence of massive pre-Columbian agricultural civilizations, confirmed that what the jungle had absorbed could be vaster than anyone outside the indigenous knowledge systems had allowed themselves to imagine. If the forest could conceal entire lost civilizations for centuries, what else might be moving through its blackwater channels, unhurried, unrecorded, waiting for the one small boat that would happen to navigate too close? The team completed their expedition. They emerged from the river system changed in the particular way that authentic encounter changes people. Not dramatically, not visibly, but in the way a landscape viewed from within, rather than from a map, changes from abstraction to lived reality. The lead researcher carried his journals out of the forest as he had carried them in, carefully, as though they contained something irreplaceable. What he chose to share from those journals, and what he chose to keep, speaks to the peculiar situation of the scientist who encounters something the profession is not yet ready to receive. The formal expedition report, later circulated to a limited academic audience, contained the biological data, water samples, species counts, vegetation surveys. It contained photographs of caiman and river turtles and bird species endemic to the region. It contained the careful, cautious prose of people who understood that professional credibility was not a currency to spend carelessly. What it did not contain, what it contained only in the margins, in the personal accounts, in the private conversations years later, was the full measure of what had passed alongside that small wooden boat in the narrow Blackwater Channel, and how long the body had taken to end. Among those who researched large-bodied constricting snakes, the question of what maximum size Eunectes murinus can reach in the wild, as opposed to in captivity, where constraints on size are well understood, remains genuinely open. Published maximum lengths from verified specimens hover in a range that already defies easy imagination. But the distribution of size in wild populations is inherently difficult to sample. The largest individuals are presumably the oldest, the most experienced, the most thoroughly habituated to avoiding human contact. The animals that explorers and researchers have occasionally reported at scales exceeding what the published record acknowledges are not, in this reading, biological impossibilities. They are the inevitable tale of a size distribution that the jungle has simply never allowed science to fully sample. The ribeirinhos, when asked directly, are consistent in their testimony across communities separated by hundreds of river miles. They speak not of monsters, they speak of very large animals that exist, that have territories, that have behaviors that can be encountered and, if one observes the appropriate conduct, survived. The conduct is specific. Do not enter the water in known territories. Do not make sounds that mimic the acoustic signatures of the snake's prey. Do not navigate the deepest channels during the periods when anacondas are most behaviorally active. This is not folklore in the dismissive sense. This is ecological knowledge refined across centuries of coexistence, encoded in practice because it worked, because the communities that followed it survived the river, and the ones that did not follow it sometimes did not survive. The Amazon is changing, faster now than at any point in recorded history, and faster than any of the forest's accumulated knowledge systems were built to accommodate. The great rivers are responding to alterations in their watersheds in ways that researchers are only beginning to understand. Species that have been behaviorally stable for millions of years are being compressed into diminishing habitat, their territories overlapping with human activity in new and unpredictable ways. The encounters that explorers have documented, the ones passed through whispered testimony rather than formal report, may, under these pressures, become less exceptional. The forest is not inexhaustible, and as its margins shrink, its deepest inhabitants are being pushed toward the edges where the boats run. Among the most telling aspects of the expedition account is what happened afterward, not in the field, but in the years of ordinary professional life that followed. The lead researcher continued his work. He published papers, attended conferences, trained students in the careful methods of fieldwork he had always practiced. But when conversations in those settings turned, as they periodically did, to questions of unverified size reports, of the outer limits of the species, of what might still be in the river systems that instruments hadn't yet reached, something in his manner would shift, not toward skepticism, not toward enthusiastic endorsement, toward a careful neutrality that those who knew him recognized as something other than agnosticism, as the neutrality of a person who has seen something they have not yet found the right language to present. The jungle permits certain revelations and withholds others according to principles that have nothing to do with human curiosity or scientific readiness. The geoglyphs waited beneath the canopy for centuries before satellite imagery happened to look down at the right angle. The terra preta lay in the soil for millennia before a soil scientist thought to analyze its composition. New species are formally described every year from the Amazon: insects, plants, fish, amphibians, animals that have existed alongside human presence for all of recorded history and simply never been encountered in the particular way that yields a specimen and a Latin name. The river, in other words, is not finished with its revelations. It is simply deciding when and to whom and at what cost. What the four researchers brought back from their expedition was not a specimen. It was not a photograph clear enough to silence debate, not a measurement that would hold up to peer review, not the kind of evidence that ends conversations. What they brought back was the knowledge, private, unverifiable, and utterly certain in the way that direct experience is always certain, that the river holds things that science has not yet caught. That somewhere in the Blackwater channels, in the sheltered Oxbow lakes, in the flooded Igapo forests where even experienced navigators hesitate, there are animals moving through the dark water with the unhurried patience of something that knows it will never be caught. And the forest remembers them, even when the water has stilled and the mist has settled and the river has swallowed every trace of what passed through it. The forest remembers. The ribeirinhos remember and pass the knowledge forward in the way knowledge survives when writing is not the medium. Through the posture of a canoe paddler on a particular stretch of river, through the way an elder's hand gesture shapes a warning into a story, through the silence that falls over a community fire when someone mentions a certain tributary by its old name. And sometimes, on the expeditions that return from those channels with everything they set out for and something more they didn't plan on, researchers remember too. Not always in their published work, sometimes only in the journals they carry out of the forest like artifacts. Carefully, as though the pages contain something alive, the Amazon keeps its secrets beneath a living roof no satellite fully penetrates. The great serpent that moved alongside a small wooden boat in a narrow Blackwater channel is back in its river now, in its depths, in its territories, unhurried as ever, untroubled by the memory of 4 people who saw it and came away without evidence sufficient to satisfy a review committee. Perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the river's deepest inhabitants have earned their privacy through millions of years of perfect adaptation, and the most respectful response to encountering them is to reverse the outboard motor slowly and let the current accept the boat back the way it came. Or perhaps one day the forest will choose to reveal what it has been holding. Perhaps a clear photograph will emerge. Perhaps a formal measurement will be taken. Perhaps the river will offer up what it has been keeping, and the gap between what science accepts and what the jungle insists will finally close. Until then, the Blackwater runs where it runs, the Anaconda moves where it moves, and the Amazon holds its counsel with the patience of something that has outlasted every civilization that ever tried to map it. If the mysteries that maps can't mark and science can't yet fully explain are what pull you forward, if the whisper of something vast and unhurried in dark water calls to you the way it called to those 4 researchers in their small wooden boat, then this is where you belong. Subscribe to Secrets of the Amazon Jungle and venture deeper into the green infinity where the river keeps its own accounts and the forest chooses what to remember and what to reveal.